chance to already, please do open up the chat and just let us know where you are joining us from today and what level of ESL learners you're working with. So my name is Andrea Echelberger. We're going to introduce ourselves a little bit more in the next slide, but want to take a minute and welcome you to Challenges, Opportunities, and Techniques, Teaching Pronunciation Remotely for One or Many, and emphasizing that while what Colleen and I will be focusing on today is how do we teach pronunciation remotely. But please do keep in mind that all of the techniques and what we're going to be talking about can also be used and applied in person. So even when we are back in person, you're going to be able to get a lot of information from this session that you will be able to use, and also be thinking about how can you be using this in hybrid teaching models as well. So I'm going to let you know a little bit about us. My name is Andrea Echelberger, and I'm the Literacy Minnesota ESL Training Coordinator. I've done a lot of work, been really lucky to do a lot of work around pronunciation over the past 15 years. I'm a co-creator of the Pronunciation Studies Circle and Pronunciation in the Classroom videos through Literacy Minnesota that I developed working in conjunction with my colleague Suzanne McCurdy, and have also done a lot of presenting at the state level and then also national level, specifically on doing pronunciation integration in the classroom. And when Patsy asked if I would be interested in doing a pronunciation session with Colleen Meyers, I of course said yes, because Colleen is actually, I met her back when I was getting my master's in ESL at Hamline University. She was teaching the phonetics and phonology course, which is kind of when everything just clicked for me and I became really interested in pronunciation, and has been just an amazing mentor and colleague. So I'm really excited to be able to introduce my co-presenter today, who is Colleen Meyers. Colleen, do you want to turn on your camera and let people know a little bit about you?
Yes, thank you, Andrea. I was going to say it's also been my pleasure to work with you. I remember you from the class, and you were certainly a star student. And I also didn't need to hesitate a minute to work with you today. So thanks for the opportunity. So a little bit about me. I used to teach at the University of Minnesota, but I'm retired now. Currently, I'm working for Literacy Minnesota, and I'm tutoring a couple of students as a volunteer. I'm also the co-author of several pronunciation materials for non-native speakers of English. And I'm a frequent TESOL presenter, and usually I'm part of the Pre-Conference Institute on teaching pronunciation, and specifically intonation, the intonation segment. So that's a little bit about me. Okay, so our objectives for today, we mainly have 4 objectives for you. First of all, we want to talk about strengthening pronunciation skills to improve learners' literacy skills, then include a variety of speaker models to create a more inclusive classroom. So going beyond just having a native speaker as the model for pronunciation progress. After that, talk about generating activities moving from controlled to communicative practice for pronunciation features, because many times we may dip into pronunciation, but we don't really follow through, so that students can integrate the feature into their speech. And finally, deciding when and how to effectively provide error correction.
So we're going to be talking about the 4 main things that we'll be looking at today is, like Colleen said, impact of pronunciation on literacy skills, speaker models, sequencing practice, and error correction. And we'll also wrap up with some suggestions for resources at the end that people can go ahead and dig into more deeply. You know, we don't have a lot of time here together. This is a big topic. So we selected things that we thought would be the most useful for people just thinking about how to integrate pronunciation regularly into their teaching. So I'm going to talk about the impact of pronunciation on literacy skills. I'm going to talk about this briefly, but this is kind of as we're setting the stage, before we dig into what do we actually do a little bit of the why. Why do we want to teach this? So as most of us are probably familiar with and know anecdotally that, it's really no surprise, the pronunciation, a speech component that's been really underrepresented in textbooks and tends to be tested in the real world rather than a standardized classroom test. It's often neglected or regulated to sporadic error correction, despite the best intentions of teachers. And when we think about how does pronunciation help learners, obviously there's a very strong, obvious link between learners' speaking skills and learners' listening skills when it comes to working on pronunciation in class. However, there is a lot of really interesting research, particularly research with lower level learners, that is showing that there is a link between pronunciation and reading comprehension. So what we've heard is that, and what we know is that learners who have an inaccurate grasp of the sounds and stress patterns that make up a word are going to be more likely to have fuzzy and imprecise word representations, which can lead to issues with recognizing and producing target words. So just to unpack that a little bit, people who are reading, so people who are readers in any language that have languages with an alphabetic writing system, what our brains do is store the most recently read material, approximately about as much as the reader can say out loud in 2 seconds, in their phonological loop rather than their visuospatial sketchpad. Should have practiced saying that word out loud. So readers in these languages, literally, they're not seeing what they have just read, they are hearing it. So we can see that if somebody is reading something and they are hearing it differently than the way it is said out loud as they read, that can really cause a lot of issues with reading comprehension. Because if you are decoding and sounding out a word, and what you hear in your head is different than the way that you have learned the word when you are practicing speaking it and doing listening practice, are you actually reading the word, or are you just like kind of coming up with a whole different word? For example, I was embarrassingly old, I want to say late 20s, before I realized that the word macabre was the same as the word macabre that I had been reading for almost 3 decades. So you can see, this is just an example on a very small scale, but learners, particularly learners who are starting off, it's really, really important that they're being taught the sounds and the patterns of English so that as they read, what they hear in their head is accurate and lining up with what they hear when they are doing the speaking and listening practice so that they can help with the comprehension. And if the learners have a reliable repertoire of the second language phonemes in the long-term memory, it's a lot easier for them to decode the written second language text into clear, well-differentiated words. And then they can use those words for comprehension. So any activities that are going to improve the recognition of minimal pairs, stress patterns in words, and generally the phonological characteristics. How does the language sound? What is the rhythm? Can very well prepare learners to read better. Because learners who lack an awareness of the phonemes in the target language have less capacity to hold those words in their working memory. They're going to last for shorter, or they're going to have an inaccurate representation, which makes it harder for them to compare it to what they hear. So pronunciation, it's not just going to help learners be able to speak and listen, it's also going to help learners be able to understand what they read. And I see lots of other people have had same examples. Oh yeah, segue, I thought it was segue forever. eavesdropping. These are fantastic. So you can see that's a perfect example of how that happens even for native language speakers or really fluent language speakers in small chunks. Imagine if that was half of the words that you were trying to read. All right. Now that we have established that pronunciation is really important, it's going to also help learners become stronger readers. I am going to hand it over to Colleen to talk about speaker models.
Yes, speaker models, as I mentioned earlier, is a very important consideration when teaching pronunciation. And so let me tell you a story. I have my students do what's called a mirroring project, in which I have them imitate the actions and the words of a speaker on a video. And this is something that I did, especially at the university, but I still do it now. And I would always suggest native speaker models. But I remember one time when one of my students from China wanted to know if she could imitate a speaker of Chinese. And so I started thinking about it. And at that point, I started suggesting to students that they find somebody that sounded like them and that could be an aspirational model for them. So if we can go to the next slide. Yes, so I really like this quote. Actually, John Murphy has looked at this area as well. And he mentions here 2 advantages of working with illustrations of intelligible, comprehensible, non-native English language samples are their transparency as aspirational models and relevance to learners' pronunciation needs. Now, let me explain a couple of terms here just to make sure we're all on the same page. First of all, intelligible means that when someone speaks, you can understand word for word what they are saying. So you could write it down verbatim. Comprehensible, while related, is not exactly the same. Comprehensible means how difficult or how easy it is for you to understand. So in other words, how much work you have to do. You might be able to write down what the person is saying, but it might take a lot of effort on your part. So if we can go to the next slide. So just a couple of points I wanted to highlight, as I mentioned. First of all, using a non-native English speaker as a model is good because it's an attainable model. Some students have a hard time trying to feel like they're ever going to be able to sound like a native speaker, but if they find someone who looks and sounds like they do, then it's much easier for them to identify and to attain that level of pronunciation. And also it makes for a more inclusive classroom. So let's go on and let's look at a video in the next slide. So right now, as I mentioned, I'm working as a tutor for Literacy Minnesota, and I'm working with a native Spanish speaker. And she decided that she would like to imitate Shakira. So I'm going to show you part of the video that my student mirrored, and then I'm going to show you a little bit later about something else that she did. But I'd like you to think about a couple of things. First of all, is Shakira intelligible and comprehensible? And secondly, what are some reasons why my student might have wanted to mirror her? What is it about the way that she speaks, the way that she uses her body that makes her a good model? So let's listen.
Growing up in my country when I was around 8 years old, I remember I saw kids my age who, instead of being in school, were already working in the streets, were barefoot in the park, kids like me, whose reality was completely different than mine, only because of the circumstances into which they were born.
Okay, so if we had more time, we could have a discussion about this. But first of all, I think you would agree with me that she's very intelligible and comprehensible. So that's one important point. But also the way that she's speaking here, even though she's a bit fast, she has good pausing, she has good rhythm and intonation patterns. And she's talking about something that's very near and dear to her heart. So this is very attractive for her audience. Now let's look at my student in the next slide. And actually, let me explain before we get into this. So in the past, what I did was I had students mirror a speaker, whether it be a native speaker or a comprehensible non-native speaker of English. And I still have them do that. But people kept saying, well, does this carry over into their own speech? And so I started doing what's called channeling. And when they channel, after they've mirrored their chosen model, then they try to channel that person in their own speech. So here's M, my student who's a Spanish speaker, and she's speaking in a way in which she's trying to be Shakira. So she's trying to mirror what she learned from Shakira, and also talking about something that's near and dear to her heart. So let's listen and see if we can identify some ways that she's like Shakira.
In recent years, people often ask me about the caravans from Central America and why do kids come to the United States by themselves. This is a topic that touched me deeply because I'm a mother and because I'm from Central America. In the past 5 years, thousands of people, including kids and teenagers, started to walk miles and miles, some of them with only flip-flops on their feet and plastic bags in their hands.
So as you can see, she's tried to adapt some of the features that she learned from Shakira, trying to use body language, trying to have better rhythm patterns, trying to pause. Her speech isn't perfect. She's still, when she's trying to say teenagers, flip-flops, might be a little bit hard to understand, but her way of speaking, at least I find, is very, very engaging. And also the topic, when she was talking about caravans coming from Central America, something very near and dear to her heart. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so not only do we need to think about the choice of models for our students, but also, as I mentioned earlier, practicing so that this is not just dipping into pronunciation, but actually practicing so that students can learn how to integrate the pronunciation feature into their free speech. Now, this is not going to happen automatically, but we've got some guidelines to help you. So next slide. All right, so what we like to do is use a communicative framework for teaching pronunciation. And actually, there are 5 steps here, as you can see. So let me explain one by one how this works. So I'll use the example of B and P. And in your packet, you have a handout that goes through a segmental contrast, the B and P, and also a suprasegmental contrast. So description and analysis, the teacher might start by saying words with B and P, maybe holding up a piece of paper and having students pay attention to the aspiration or puff of air on the P versus the B. So that would be the first step. Then from there, moving on to listening discrimination. So the teacher might say some words and with P and B at the beginning or end of the word, and the students would have to identify the differences. After that, we would move into controlled practice. So controlled practice would be, for instance, maybe minimal pair exercises. Something like my name begins with a P versus my name begins with a B. And so students might work in pairs. One would have to listen and tell the other person if they heard A or B. So we're familiar with this. Going into guided practice, the difference between guided practice and controlled practice is that there's still a focus on accuracy, but there's a little bit more freedom. So in the handout that we've shared with you, an example might be for students to imagine that they're going on a picnic and they have to decide what things they're going to bring. And many of the items have B's and P's in them. So for example, napkins, paper plates, picnic basket. Okay, so that would be guided practice. And then finally, the last stage would be communicative practice. And at this stage, they might do something like choosing the 5 items that they absolutely can't do without for their picnic. And so at that stage, they would be thinking about communication, but still the focus would be on using the B and the P. Okay, so that's the communicative framework. At this point, Andrea is going to take you through this with a segmental.
All right. And Colleen, please tell your learner you swapped that video out. I hadn't had a chance to watch it, and there was a lot of emotion. She did a fantastic job. You can see how powerful that activity is. So we're going to take a look at sequencing practice with a final consonant articulation. So what are we talking about when we're talking about final consonant articulation? Why should we, big question is, why should we teach it? Well, it's really important for intelligibility. And I think I got this example from Colleen. The were is very difficult. What could that mean? I'll let people go ahead and pop some ideas in the chat. The were is very difficult. What might I mean by that? World, work, word, were. Yeah, so you can see just by all of these different examples that came in. Worm, maybe I'm doing a science experiment. But you can see by these different examples, final consonants in English carry a lot of meaning. When we are dropping final consonants, whether that's the final consonant at the end of the word, like school versus school, or a final consonant that's a part of a consonant cluster where we have 2 or more consonants together, it can completely change the meaning of the word. So things like no versus nose, or scar versus scarf. I have a big scar versus I have a big scarf. That there is a lot of meaning that is carried in that final sound. So it's really common for students who don't have a lot of final consonants at the end of their language, at the end of syllables, if they have an open syllable structure where most syllables end in a vowel sound. It's very common for people to drop final consonants, and also really common, not a lot of languages have as many consonant clusters as English. English likes to be special and be unique and be as challenging as possible. So it's very natural for people to, if there are sounds that they're not used to hearing in their first language, or to kind of change the way that they speak English and speak the sounds in English, to make it easier, to make it sound more like what they're used to in their native language or native languages. So people do a lot of things in penthesis, adding an additional sound onto the end. Like one of my favorite examples is working with a lot of Somali learners. Like for example, the word milk will often become milky, where there's an additional syllable, an additional sound. Replacing different sounds, so swapping out sounds with something that's more familiar and easier to say, deleting sounds altogether, or reducing sounds so that you don't hear them as clearly. And this is really different. Like I said, this is really different than other languages because a syllable in English must have a vowel sound and can have up to 4 consonant sounds after the vowel. And there are 169 possible combinations in the syllable final position, which again is very different than a lot of languages. So this is something that's important, and this is something that can go across backgrounds, where different language backgrounds, maybe you have 17 different languages in your class, and something that everybody will benefit from practicing. So let's see what it looks like if we are teaching online, and we do some different steps to walk through those 5 stages of the communicative framework. So the first step is description and analysis. So after I've taught the new vocabulary, we're doing a unit on physical descriptors, adjectives to describe how people look. Then I'm going to have the learners listen to 2 different words and tell me, are they the same or different, and what's different about them? So ball and bald, ball and bald. Are they the same or different? Okay, they're different. Well, what's different about them? Brow and brown, brow and brown. Beer and beard. Shore and short. So again, I'm not going to necessarily tell learners, here's what you should listen to. I'm going to be saying the different words and having them pick out, can they hear the difference and can they articulate what's different between them? And then we can bring in the pictures and show, it's very different. If I say he has a beer versus he has a beard, I mean 2 totally different things. The next activity, and I see a comment from Allison. Yep, this was something really big for me, where I had a student who we're working on saying the word school, and I would say school, and she would say school, school, school. And I finally said, what's the last sound? School. And she said, ooh. And I had realized kind of what Allison is saying is that she literally, the learner I was working with, literally couldn't hear the last sound. So that's why that description and analysis is really important, to get people to realize that it's there and know that they need to start to listen and pay attention to it. And then the listening discrimination is where we start literally training the brain. So we're training the brain to be able to hear the new sounds and the new patterns. So the next one that we can do for that listening discrimination, you can do a simple activity where you have students, I love mini whiteboards, and these work great if you're doing Zoom class or Google Meet class. If you don't have a mini whiteboard, you can always have people just write things down on a paper and then show with their phones or use the chat. But you can do an activity, show me the last sound you hear. So if I say beer, beer, what's the last sound you hear? And students would write an R. If I say beard, beard, he has a beard, what's the last sound you hear? And students write a D. If I say the word ball, what's the last sound you hear? We have an L. If I say the word bald, what's the last sound you hear? An D. So a simple activity, you can do it. The easiest way to do it when you have people doing it online is to have them just write it down again on their notebook, or if you have a mini whiteboard. All right, so let's move on to controlled practice, where learners are producing the sounds, but it's highly controlled. So I'm going to share about a 3-minute clip from a video that Suzanne and I put together of me teaching in a class. So this is an in-person class, but we'll watch this clip and then I'll quickly unpack how you could do something similar teaching remotely, but wanted you to give a chance to hear learners producing the language.
next thing we're going to do is we're going to have two students who will talk together. So will you be my partner? We will show everybody what we will do. So you need your cards. One student is going to listen. One student is going to read and speak. So we are together. What is your name?
My name is
Ella. Ella and I are together. I am going to read and speak. Ella is going to listen and show me the last sound. Okay. All right. So ride, ride, ride. Okay. Ride. What's the last sound? D. Ride. Okay. So she shows me D, and I say, good. Train. Train. Okay. Okay, can you show everybody? Is that okay?
Yes.
Good. So then when we're finished, we will change. Ella, can you read? So Ella is going to read. What do I do? Yeah. If we are together, Ella is going to read. I need to.
Last letter.
Yeah. Last letter.
Yeah.
Listen
Yeah.
and show.
Back. Back.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Bus. Bus. Yeah.
Okay. Do one more.
Right. Right.
Is that okay? Good. So if your partner shows you the wrong letter, you have to, no, you have to say it again. You'll need to say it again. Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Right.
Red.
Right. Yeah.
She has a good memory. This is remembering. I have to look. Good memory.
Back. Back.
All right, so yes, this was filmed at HAP. Back in the days when we could be in person, in Mark's class when he was there. And I saw a question, did I create the word list or do you have a text or other resource you use? So anytime I'm teaching pronunciation, I let the content drive the pronunciation, drive the pronunciation that I work on. So I pull the words that we practice directly from the text, directly from the unit, as opposed to coming up with kind of random word lists that fit the pattern. So I always try to be really content focused. So a few things to think about doing this type of activity online. You can put students into breakout rooms, small group breakout rooms, and have students read words in breakout rooms, and other students can write down that final sound, what they hear, in the chat or in a notebook, and just keep track and then go back and compare. So these are the final sounds I heard. Did those match up with the words you said? So you can do it if you have small groups, have students take turns. There can be multiple students listening instead of having people in partners, which can be a little trickier to manage when you have a large group. And I see a question useful for other students who might not have similar final consonant issues. Absolutely, and in this class, the learners who are who we see are mostly Karen learners, but there's also Somali learners, which are two very different languages. But Somali doesn't have as many consonant clusters and tends to do more epenthesis, adding that extra sound. So doing this, even though we have two very different languages, was really good practice, and articulating that final sound is good practice for anyone. So let's look at guided practice. So here's what I have for guided practice. And this is what I would do is I would have learners in small groups or in a large group calling kind of popcorn style on learners. I would have them work together to describe the pictures and kind of keep adding on to it. So looking at the picture on the left, the first learner could say, I see a tall woman, or the woman is tall. And then the second learner could say, the woman is tall and she has brown hair. And the next learner could say, the woman is tall, she has brown hair, and the man is short. So practicing describing the pictures, adding on additional words. And then the same thing for the picture on the right, where learners take turns looking at the picture, describing it, using the words and adding on kind of one at a time. And then the final activity and that final step would be the communicative practice. So I have 3 different pictures, and learners would take turns describing the picture. So, the man is bald, he has a beard, he has blue eyes. The man has brown hair, he has a beer. And then the other learners in the group would go ahead and share what number that they heard it. So lots of chances for more of that spontaneous practice. And there's that immediate feedback for learners know, did I say it right? Because they're going to know whether or not people were able to understand.
Andrea, I just wanted to mention in the chat, Elizabeth, Jean has a question, I believe going back to the controlled exercise. How would they do the auditory part if they both can see the written word?
So what we're doing in the class, and you can't see the board, but all of the words are actually written down on the board. So both learners have access to be able to see the words on the board. But what I'm encouraging people to do is don't think about how it's spelled. Think about what you hear. So for that activity, I don't worry if people can see all of the words. And ideally, if you were able to do it, you could even do this with pictures. You don't have to have the written words. You could just have different pictures and people look at the vocabulary pictures and then they say the word that's tied into it. And then that can actually be great because it takes the reading aspect out of it. And when we're, teaching online with slides, it's so much easier to just put pictures onto slides as opposed to printing pictures off and then taping them all over the board. So in some ways, it can be even easier to do this now that we are teaching online. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Colleen to do a higher level suprasegmental example.
Okay, so basically, what I'm going to be showing you is some higher level students, although some of them are not that, or one of them at least is not that high, but working on contrastive stress. So just to remind you what contrastive stress is it's a type of emphasis when you're comparing and contrasting two things. So for example, I might say, I love muffins, but I don't like donuts. So muffins and donuts would be contrasted. Okay, so why teach it? A couple of things here. First of all, it's important for intelligibility. So the research that's been done shows that misplaced prominence can cause listeners to work harder to make connections, to have poorer comprehension of content, and misinterpret the intent of what is said. And actually, in a little bit, when I show you a controlled exercise, I think you'll see what I'm talking about. Because before the student uses contrastive stress, it's hard to figure out what she's saying. Another reason to teach it is that it can be very different in other languages. So some languages put emphasis on the last word, not the contrastive or contrasted word. So for example, they might say, it's not my fault, it's your fault, instead of it's not your fault, it's my fault. Also, some languages don't decrease the pitch for old information. So they might say something like, it's not your fault, it's my fault. And so because the pitch is so high, it's hard to pick out what's contrasted. And then finally, some languages don't realize this feature the same as English. Sometimes students will use only volume, for example. So when I was teaching at the university, I had some students, for instance, that would try to use this, but they would just get louder. So it would sound like they were admonishing the listener and say something like, it's not your fault, or I'm sorry, it's not your fault, it's my fault, rather than saying, it's not your fault, it's my fault. So the tone that accompanies those phrases and those contrasts can make a big difference. And then finally, there's research that shows that this is learnable. We know that not all aspects of pronunciation are learnable. Okay, so going on to the next slide. Also, I just wanted to give a shout out to Judy Gilbert's prosody pyramid. And basically, this I really like because it helps me to figure out what exactly I'm going to teach. There's so much in terms of pronunciation, but she talks about the primary area to work on is thought groups. So getting students to speak in thought groups. So for instance here, how do you spell easy? Then within the thought group, finding the focus word. So for example, easy is the focus word. That has to be clear. The stress syllable in that focus word has to be correct. If someone says, how do you spell easy? Somebody might not understand. And then finally, she calls the vowel in that stress syllable the peak vowel. So if somebody were to say, how do you spell izzy? Okay, that's going to change the meaning altogether. So this is another reason why I like to focus on contrastive stress. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Description and analysis. I might have students say something in their own language, and then I might say something in English or perhaps a translation. And I really like this visual from Linda Grant, because then we'll talk about not only for contrastive stress, but for rhythm and intonation, different features that some languages give equal emphasis to each and every syllable. So for example, you might say, I want to go to the store tomorrow. Only they might say it really fast, or but the point is that every syllable would have the same emphasis. Whereas in English, we have motorcycles, which are unstressed syllables. Then we have cars that have a little bit more stress. And then we have this big bus. And so the big bus would be the word that gets contrasted. So for instance, I might say, I want to go to the store tomorrow. Okay, so go, store are cars, and tomorrow is the bus. And of course, the bus can change, but we can see that this is much longer and higher in pitch. So that's description and analysis. Then let's move on to step 2, which is listening discrimination. So I like to use quotations, and you'll see a couple of videos where my students are working with quotations. And so what I'll do is I'll have them listen to me read a sentence, and then they'll circle the word that I'm emphasizing, and then decide how they know it's emphasized. And I'll say, okay, think about stress. So maybe at this point we've talked about word stress, but now we're thinking about stress at a different level. And so I might choose this quote by Eleanor Roosevelt. Anger is only one letter short of danger. If someone betrays you once, it's his fault. If he betrays you twice, it's your fault. And so we'll talk about how they know. I'll have them focus not only on what I say, but on my body language. I don't know if you can see that, but I often, or speakers often use their hands when they're trying to make something especially clear. Okay, so that's the listening discrimination. Then the next step would be controlled practice. And so what I'll do is I'll have my students look at some quotes and mark where they think the contrastive stress or emphasis should be. And then I'll have them read those out loud. So here's a student of mine from Somalia, and she's going to be reading one of the quotes here. So listen as she reads it the first time. And now she's had a chance to read it. She knows all the words here, but listen to the way that she says it. So if we can listen to the video. Say this the way you think it should be said. Say the whole sentence.
He who lose money lose much. He who lose a friend lose more. He who lose faith lose all.
Okay.
Loses.
Yeah. Let me. Okay. So let me say it the way I would and listen to what I'm emphasizing. He who loses money loses much. He who loses a friend loses much more. He who loses faith loses all. Okay, so what words am I emphasizing? What about here?
Oh, you did. No, you didn't.
Okay, I only emphasized money. Okay, so if I use my kazoo, listen to the way I say it. Okay, can you hear that?
Yes.
Okay, can you try it?
Yeah, so yeah. He who lose money lose much. He who lose friends lose more, much more. He who lose faith lose all.
Perfect. You got it. You got it. There's only one little thing, and it's not with emphasis or contrastive stress. And that's, what's this word here?
Loses.
Right, 2 syllables, loses. Okay, so basically, I wanted to focus on the use of contrastive stress. And so after she was done, then I commented on loses. But in addition to kazoo, and when I used to teach in person, now I'm teaching mainly online, I would bring kazoos and give them out to all of the students. And of course, I would have to teach them how to use the kazoo, not lose the kazoo, use the kazoo. And another thing is that many of us know about using a rubber band for stress. I like to have students use a rubber band for length, but when they get to emphasis and contrastive stress, I like to have them use the rubber band this way. And so in another video that I have of the same student, she's doing another quote, but she's going up and down like this to remind herself that those words are not only longer, but they're higher in pitch. Other things that you can do is have students use their hands. So he who loses money loses much. So have them use their hands, have them stand up and sit down, stand up for the emphasized words. In this particular case, I didn't have my student do that because she's in the same room as her daughter, who's studying her own class. And so it's hard for her to stand up and move around. But there are some things that you can have students do even at home that gives them some activity where they can move around. Okay, so let's go on to the next part, the guided practice. This is a student of mine from Liberia. I'll call him S, and he's just read the quote by Eleanor Roosevelt, yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, today is a gift. And so after he had practiced that, I had him talk about it in terms of whether or not he agreed with it. And this was right after January 6th, when there was the siege of the Capitol. So let's watch how he explains here.
Yes, I agree. For example, what happened on Wednesday at the Capitol is history. Like,
yeah, it's
gone.
history now.
It's gone. People regret. I'm sure even President Trump supporters who did what they did, they do regret, but it's history. It's in the past. We can't change it again. Tomorrow, it's a mystery because we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So we can't know. So it's left with wonders.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see what tomorrow will bring.
Mm-hmm.
And today, it's a gift because right now we can make decisions. We can change what we couldn't do yesterday, and we can change things that will take an effect tomorrow. So that is, today is a gift, and that's why they call it the present. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Okay, so notice at the end, he went back to what I call his default setting. That's why they call it the present. Okay, so as he was focusing on this, he was using good contrastive stress. He was pausing. Also at the end, perhaps it was that he was just summarizing, and so he didn't use a lot of emphasis. But anyway, you can see what he did with this exercise. And then if we can go on to the next one, this is the communicative practice. And so following that same theme, I might have students bring in sayings commonly used in their own culture. And as they describe them or share them, to make sure and pause and use contrastive stress. But I also like to do other things. So find the differences games are fun. And there are so many of them on the internet, and my students just love them. So let's look at the next slide, and I'll show you what I did with S, also from Liberia. And so let's listen here. This is a short video.
In the right hand of the pendant on the left, there are 5 leaves of flower.
5 or 4?
Oh, sorry, there are 4 leaves on a branch.
Mm-hmm.
But in the hands of the pendant on the right, there are only 3 leaves on the branch.
Perfect, perfect. That was great. That was great. Okay, and for this, I just want to say, this was towards the end of the lesson when we had practiced quite a bit. He had some difficulty with some of the areas that we talked about before, like not bringing his pitch down. But at this point, he was getting the idea. And he, again, really enjoyed this activity, and we worked with it to find all 5 differences. Okay, so at this point, Andrea is going to put you into breakout rooms, and I'll let her tell you a little bit about what you'll be doing, and we hope you're going to stay. Please don't leave. So go ahead, Andrea.
Thank you, Colleen. Yeah, so we're going to do brief breakout rooms. So you're going to have 4 minutes in your breakout room. You'll get a 1-minute warning, or 3 minutes in your breakout room, 1-minute warning to come back. So this is going to be fast. And I already see 4 people left. No one else can leave. This is going to be really good. I promise. So you're going to do something really simple in your breakout room, but just want to be thinking a little bit more about what are different activities you could do and where in those sequence of events do those fall. So think about in your breakout room, and you can do which level if you want to focus on low level or high level, and come up with some word stress activities, since word stress is one of those big topics that's easy to teach and really, really important. So come up with some different activities in your group that you can do to practice word stress, and then decide what stage would the activity fall into: description analysis, listening discrimination, controlled, guided, or communicative. Where do you think? And Astrid has gone ahead and posted that into the chat. So when you get into your room, you can open up the chat and see it. We'll come back after 4 minutes and we will go to the fourth part, which is error correction. So we're going to get to learn about error correction and pronunciation with Colleen when we come back in 4 minutes.
All right, here we go.
Hi. Oh, hey, Jean.
Hey.
Hi there. You do need to hit the join link, Jean, in order to. There you go. All right, Elif, I see you're here. 1 second, I'll get you in a group. All right, everyone has been assigned to a room. If you're still here and you wanted to join a breakout, you do need to hit the join button on your screen. If you're simply not able to join a breakout right now, we get that too. So for Suzanne, Sue, Cindy, if you're having any trouble getting to your breakout, just let me know. If you just can't join, no worries, you can stay with us too.
All right, and for the sake of time, we are just going to go on to the next section, error correction, with Colleen. So, a big part of pronunciation is definitely error correction, and students appreciate it and benefit from it. But as we know, error correction can't be the only thing we do, and there's a lot of considerations to keep in mind for what are you going to do with error correction. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Colleen to talk to us about error correction.
Whoops, where am I? Oh, there. Okay. All right. So if you can go on to the next slide. So first of all, research shows that students want to have the opportunity to correct themselves by responding to the teacher's request that prompts them to modify their utterances. So students do want correction. But going on to the next slide, we can see that error correction is complex. So we've got 4 questions that we have to decide. First of all, what should I do about the error? Should I even correct it or not? When should it be corrected? Now, later in the lesson, the next lesson? Who should correct it? Should the learners themselves? Should peers correct? Or should the teacher do the correction? And finally, how should it be corrected? So these are important considerations. So moving on to the next slide. So in terms of what, maybe we already know this, but to remember, don't correct everything. I remember when I first started teaching, this was before I got my master's degree, and I was correcting everything. And my poor students were interrupted all the time. They lost their self-confidence. So I quickly learned to limit to one focus point. In terms of sounds, we have what's called the functional load. And if anybody wants, you can contact us and we can send you a list. But basically, it is based on research, and it shows that certain sounds, again, like P and B, have a high functional load. So if somebody mispronounces the P or B, it's going to interfere with understanding. But the lowly TH usually doesn't get in the way. And so a lot of teachers want to correct THs, but the research shows that it's not so important. Again, prioritize errors based on intelligibility. And if it's something you've covered before, stop and ask the students to self-correct. So for instance, my Spanish speaker worked on the word project and worked on the just sound. And then she was doing an activity and she said project. And I said project. And then she was able to self-correct and say project. Okay, the next slide. If you're doing controlled practice, because the focus is accuracy, you can give feedback at any time. But for guided and communicative practice, it's probably better to delay until completion of the activity. And it can be either the teacher or other learners. So let's go ahead to the next slide. And so this one, this diagram I really like, because self-correction, again, there are opportunities where students can listen to themselves and even transcribe what they have said and self-correct. Peer correction, I really like this visual because one of the suggestions that Cels Murcia makes is to have students work in groups of 3. So 2 students can be doing the activity. The third person can have a checklist and they can be giving feedback at the end or whenever it's appropriate, depending on what type of level you're doing. And then finally, of course, there's teacher correction. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Get students to help each other. If you haven't already, teach them ways to ask for clarification and clarify. So if they're working in pairs, give them a list of phrases like, what do you mean by that? Or what did you say? Or could you spell it for me? Model starting with positive feedback and also getting students to start with the positive. I think this is really, really important in terms of building up self-confidence. And as I said, teach them to self-correct by recording using Zoom or WhatsApp. So the videos that I have, I've been teaching using Zoom, and I just put on the recording, save it to my computer, and then I might share it with students later. Okay, the next slide is, yeah, so how having students do oral dialogue journals where they rehearse an oral report, read a passage, or ask questions would be ways of working on individual error correction. And then the section on the right about groups, I actually just talked about with the visual, to have them work in groups of 3 and have one person be the person that's giving the feedback. Okay, and the next slide will be an example. So here's my student from Liberia again. I'd like you to look, I give him 2 pieces of feedback on his errors. One is related to the pronunciation feature, and the second one is something that we've been working on the whole semester. So go ahead and let's listen. I'm going to record again. Okay, do you agree or not?
I agree with the first part.
Okay.
that says anger is just one letter short of danger, because I know what anger leads you to. Sometimes you make the wrong decisions and you end up regretting what you did. So
Yeah.
it's just one letter from danger. Well, the second part of it that talk about if someone betrays you once, or the first time someone betrays you, it's your fault, and the second,
It's whose fault?
my fault.
Yeah, so remember the emphasis here. It's your fault, or
It's
it's
your
my
fault.
fault. Yeah,
Okay. It's your fault.
right.
And the second time is, no, the first time is his fault.
Exactly.
Whoever betrays you. And the second time is your fault. So for that part, I agree, but also I disagree.
Because that's fine. You can agree and you can disagree. Why?
Yes. The reason I agree first, because then you should have known better that someone betrays you and they're going to do it again, because now it's obvious that they take you
Slow
for
down.
granted.
Slow down a little bit. You're going too fast.
Oh, okay.
Say
So
it again.
now it's obvious that someone betrays you for the first time. So you understand they're going to do it again, because if they can do it the first time, they can do it another time. So it's completely obvious.
Okay, so as you can see here, I gave him some correction on the focus of the exercise, which was contrastive stress. And he was doing fine, but then towards the end, he went back to his default, speak very fast, don't pause, don't use much stress. And so I reminded him by saying, wait a minute, slow down, I don't understand. And then as you can see, he went back to the slower, more emphatic way of speaking. So that was the point that I wanted to make here. So let's move on, and Andrea is going to lead the second breakout discussion.
And for the sake of time, we are going to do this in the chat rather than go into breakout rooms. But Colleen, thank you so much for getting these videos. Like, it's so appreciate actually being able to see and hear what it looks like. And I'm listening to the videos going, like I am talking to your students as they are speaking. So we're going to just look at two different scenarios, and I'll just have people respond to the chat. So let's start with number one. You're working with a low-level class of students from a variety of language backgrounds. You've just taught the group the correct stress and pronunciation of the keywords in the chapter, but one of your students stresses the word supermarket incorrectly by saying supermarket. Why do you think she does this? You just went over the words of the group, and how would you correct her? So I'm going to go ahead and let people just respond in the chat for that, for number one. So I see people guessing maybe she's a French speaker, maybe it's the native language. So she's using a similar pattern or similar pronunciation pattern. So what would people do? How would you correct them? So I see clap it out. Maybe, I know supermarket. I'm using hands and having the learner and the learners all repeat. Split it into two words. Show her a list of English words that have the same syllabic stress. Tap, so you can tap it out. Use big or small circles to visualize. So you can do circles, bubble. I call that bubbles of stress. So do a big bubble above the stress syllable and small bubbles. Yep, rubber bands. That's great. Like what Colleen showed with the emphasis, you can use it with the stress. Supermarket. Great. And the kazoo, yeah. Let's just pull the word out. Let's just listen to the rhythm. Great. All right, so lots of really good ideas. Let's look and see if when we're working with a high level class, if we make any changes. So this one, number 2, you're working with a high level class of students who are discussing the importance of determining the true outcome of the election. One student says determine, and the rest pick up on this and continue saying the word the same way. How do you help them remember how to say this important word correctly in the future? So wondering, what would you do? How would you help students remember? Anything the same from the first? Would you do anything differently? So maybe look at words that rhyme. Talk about root words and parts. We're working with higher level students. Using caps in the chat to emphasize which syllable is stressed. Great. Anything else? Have the student look at the word again and see if the student can self-correct. So hey, could you say that word again? This word, how would you say that? So show that penultimate stress, penultimate means second from the end, stress is common. Yeah, we don't have a lot of words in English, particularly, we don't have a lot of words in English where we have the stress on the that final syllable. It's not a very common stress pattern. Good. All right, well, I see we are getting to the end. And so I'm gonna go ahead, Colleen, I don't know if you have anything else to jump in here before we go to our final thoughts and resources.
I do, but in the interest of time, maybe I can just write some things in the chat.
Perfect. So if you want to write things in the chat, and then I know we can stay on for a couple minutes at the end if anybody has anything explicit, but we want to make sure that we respect everybody's time and are wrapping up by the end. So just to wrap us up, some final thoughts and resources. So wanted to emphasize our take-home message for you is that strengthening pronunciation skills is going to help improve literacy skills. So it's going to help all across the board, whatever the level of the learner. Provide students opportunities to choose their own models. Who do they want to sound like? And oftentimes if someone can choose someone who has a similar accent as they do, but is very intelligible, that's a fantastic, achievable model. Sequence activities from description and analysis through communicative practice. So think about sequencing, and I know I pointed out in the chat, we showed this kind of doing it all in a row. You don't have to do all of the activities right in a row. You might have them spread out over class periods. And be judicious about correcting errors and think about what, when, who, and how. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Colleen to give some quick technology tips for teaching pronunciation online.
Yes, so first of all, make sure students know how to use the technology, whether they're low level or high level. I often like to record and save on my computer whatever we do during class, as I mentioned, and then sometimes share parts with the students. Be careful having students work with websites while sharing. I made the mistake once of taking my student to this cool website, but then, and even though I had practiced with it beforehand, while she was on it, it didn't work at all. So that part of the lesson fell on its face. If possible, give students the power to share. The videos I showed today, I was controlling, but sometimes I will give the control to them and say, okay, now you make the changes here on the document so that it's easier for them to remember. And so I do it that way. Use multiple modalities. As we said, even though we're on Zoom and people are in rooms by themselves, use that to your advantage. Students can still stand up, clap, do all sorts of things at home. My Spanish speaker. I even worked with her on some breathing exercises, and she was even down on the floor trying to work on diaphragmatic breathing. And then use video journals for practice in between classes so that there's that ongoing movement up into the guided and communicative areas. And then the next slide, Andrea, yeah. And then in the folder, we have a document that has the major pronunciation challenges for the major language groups in Minnesota. Now, those of you who are coming from other states may have a different population, but at least for these populations, we have that as a resource for you. Okay, and Andrea?
Yeah, so just to let people know a few resources that we would recommend checking out. And so you'll be able to find a PDF of our PowerPoint slides, and you can click on all of these links. Baruch College has some great online exercises. English Central, Well Said by Linda Grant. Pronunciation Doctor, fabulous, fun videos. The Prosody Pyramid, and then the Atlas ESL Library. There is a whole section on pronunciation that has lots of great resources. And the Pronunciation ESL Instructional Support Kit through Literacy Minnesota. Take some time and check those resources out and see if those are resources that will work for you in your situation. All right, so wrapping us up, just want to say a huge thank you to Patsy and Astrid for running tech for us. A huge thank you to Colleen. I have so much fun presenting with you. And thank you to everybody for sticking with us until the end of the day on a Friday. Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you. And I want to just thank Andrea and Colleen for sharing with us this afternoon. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop the recording, but if people have additional questions, we won't disappear quite yet.